joining us today from all over the world. My name is Franco Verona, and I am a partner at Vintage Grail. So welcome to our very special event tonight or today, depending on where you are, in the Allure of Patek Philippe, conversation with John Reardon of Collectability. Today we'll discuss all things about Patek Philippe. I would say the Grail watch brand for many collectors all over the world. As we saw earlier this year, when the famed Patek Philippe Nautilus 5711 was being discontinued, demand for this timepiece just skyrocketed. So why has Patek remained to be so relevant and collectible in the past 182 years? To answer this question and many others, we will have an exciting conversation this evening with John, who is calling from his office in beautiful Chatham, New Jersey. I do want to remind everybody that I will be asking John some questions from the audience tonight. That's going to be at the end of our conversation. So, in the course of the evening, if you have any questions, feel free to put them in the chat box below, and I will make sure, to the best of my ability, to address them immediately. But before we begin, here's a short video about John and collectability.
So, what is collectibility? Collectibility is here for you, the collector, to make informed decisions on buying and selling vintage and pre-owned Patek Philippe watches. There are thousands of resources out there, but collectibility is here to put everything together to share with you the facts, the historical information, the database information, and all known forensic materials so you can make a decision yourself of what you're looking at, and you could decide if this is something that you want in your collection. It all comes down to this simple equation: obsession plus knowledge equals collectibility.
Obsession plus knowledge equals collectability. I mean, what an equation indeed. Just to give some context for everybody in the audience, John has spent his entire career in the world of horology, having held positions at both Sotheby's and Christie's Watches, where there he served as its international head of watches, managing a global team of watch specialists. John has developed a keen interest into the history of Patek Philippe, as he previously served at the Henry Stern Watch Agency, which of course is now known as Patek Philippe USA, as part of its sales and marketing team for nearly a decade. Since 2019, John founded collectibility.com, an online platform specializing in vintage Patek timepieces and other ephemera. John is also now the host of the Collectibility podcast, where he is engaged in in-depth conversations with experts and personalities in the watch industry, including the likes of Ben Clymer, Roni Madvani, and more recently, Davide Parmigiani. John has written several books on the brand, notably Patek Philippe in America, marketing the world's foremost watch. That was in 2008. Patek Philippe Reference Guide, Men's Wristwatches. That was published in 2010. And Patek Philippe Reference Guide, Ladies' Watches, published a short 2 years later in 2012. He's also a regular contributor to Forbes magazine and a contributing writer to Patek Philippe magazine with his column called, quite simply, The Collector's Guide. He's also a member of the Academy of the Grand Prix d'Horlogerie de Genève, a trustee of the Horological Society of New York, and a liveryman of the Worshipful Company of Clockmakers. What a cool name. So John, welcome.
Oh, thank you so much, Franco, for such a generous introduction. Such a pleasure to be with you today.
Yeah, it is an honor to be with you. And I gotta say, I've never met anybody from the Worshipful Company of Clockmakers. And perhaps later in this conversation, you can tell me the secret of how to get in, because
absolutely, with
it sounds
pleasure.
mysterious and amazing all at the same time. John, let's kick it off with a super easy question. Why should we collect Patek Philippe?
Wow, I wish we had hours to delve into that, but I'm going to attempt to do it in a minute. And I think this advertisement that we're looking at from Patek Philippe USA, 1949, really sums it up. That even in the 1940s, Patek Philippe was marketing this whole intergenerational campaign, that these watches are works of art meant to be passed down from father to son, mother to daughter, and for generations. But the part of the ad that surprised me the most is the final tag. What could be a finer investment? Now imagine that in the 1940s, Patek Philippe is sharing the concept that their watches are investments meant to be shared from generation to generation.
Oh.
And what really surprised me in researching my book is this concept dated back to 1901. And it came from the States, from the Patek Philippe marketing machine. And the idea of investing in watches went all the way back into the early 20th century. And this is something that Patek Philippe has continued to populate our minds with. It's something that we always think about with each of our pieces, of how these watches will translate through the generations. And that's something I hope we could talk about today a bit.
Yeah, just to talk about that for one quick second before we get into this beautiful watch right here. It's interesting because, I mean, would you say that that's the first example of a luxury item that was marketed as an investment piece?
It's a great point. I can't think of any others where that word was so boldly used. And ironically, today, here at Collectibility and certainly at Patek Philippe, the brand itself, the word investment is not something used. It's a kind of a taboo word to use. The market can do what it would like after the watch is sold, and we'll talk about the Nautilus later.
Yeah.
But the word investment is not something that's used so brazenly as it was 120 years ago.
Yeah, but imagine if everybody believed Patek back then, and they literally bought all those watches back then.
But some did. A select few did.
The smart ones did, right?
It's true.
Okay, now we're looking at a platinum dial. Sorry, a platinum 597P. Tell us a little bit about this and how that relates to why Patek.
Sure. A 5970P is a personal favorite, and I think for many of the watchers today around the world, they might agree. And I'm going to get a bit philosophical for a second. I was thinking, like, why Patek Philippe? Why watches today are so hot? Why are we so obsessed with this category? And I'm building this concept in my mind of just how culture has changed over the last, let's say, 1,000 years. Going back to the Middle Ages, in the Western world, the cathedral at the center of town was the height of technology, the height of art, the height of finances, the height of showing wealth, power, status. And the medieval cathedrals that we all visit today when touring the great cities of Europe, Paris, London, the list goes on. Right. We obsessed as we tore through these beautiful buildings. But now, for better or for worse, we live in a culture of materialism for the most part.
Mm-hmm.
And especially since the Industrial Revolution, this materialism is part of everything that we look at, we think about, we discuss. It is, once again, still continues to be wealth, power, status. And I propose the concept that watches, in particular Patek Philippe, are the modern day cathedrals of today. I mean, these represent, when I look at a 5970, I see the height of aesthetic beauty, technological genius, artistry. And of course, just like a cathedral, many people were involved, men and women, building this watch from start to finish. And that's why when we put these pieces on our wrists, we feel that it's a feeling. It's emotional, just like when you walk into a cathedral. It's just the feeling of simple wow, kind of knowing your place in the universe and something that's bigger than you. So that's my philosophy for the day before we get into watches.
That's super interesting, John. I mean, just to quote another watchmaker for 1 second, it's not a racing machine on your wrist. It's a cathedral on your wrist, is what you're saying.
See, I never heard that. So it's already out there.
It's
That's brilliant.
Trademarks.
But
I already went to the.
it's a conversation worth having. Is why do we obsess over these? It's really fun to think about what these really mean to us when we step back and we aren't staring at lugs and crowns and gears that we so often do.
That's true. It's the artistry of putting all these different random pieces together in such a beautiful, I mean, piece of machinery on your wrist, or a beautiful cathedral on your wrist. So, I mean, I completely understand where you're coming from, and I think that makes a lot of sense. Right. So let's take a look at the next slide and see what we're looking at here.
There's no secret that I'm obsessed with vintage.
Right.
And when I think of vintage watches, I think of pocket watches.
Yeah.
They are the most undervalued. I think they're appreciated, but their market prices are so far behind their wristwatch counterparts that when I see a watch such as this piece from 1928 that was finally sold in 1939, it just makes my heart skip. I mean, look at the side of this. You see it's channel set with baguette sapphires.
No.
And if you look more closely around the crystal itself, it's set with blue enamel, which is meant to make the crystal pop. And the dial is so simple, and it's just a Roman 12 applied. The simplicity and beauty of a watch such as this is just, to me, is what Patek Philippe is all about. Understatement. And I'm a big proponent of pocket watches, because for a tenth of the price of a wristwatch equivalent, you could own something that arguably is more unique and something that surely you could pass down to the next generation.
And there has to be a little bit of a thrill towards specifically pocket watch hunting as well. I can imagine. Would you say it's more challenging as looking for wrist pieces?
See, I'm spoiled being here in the U.S. because from the 1860s to the 1960s, over half of all Patek Philippe's went to the U.S. market. So in working with families here and treasure hunting, the safety deposit boxes and hidden under the mattresses of some, not all, American households has an important timepiece. And that is what's so much fun about now. The pocket watches from this period of time, the 20s and 30s, are surfacing. It's now that time of intergenerational change of wealth, and not everyone appreciates and understands Patek Philippe, and that's what I'm here for. It's my goal is to educate people about the importance of these pieces, and the supply is small, but the supply is being released. It's the oil reserves we know where they are, and they're starting to bubble up some oil, and we just have to find these pieces and preserve them.
Now, interesting. Just something that we spoke about a little bit prior to this event was actually taste making, right? And how Patek has really become what it is today. And there was a point that you had made in your podcast, actually, at the Collectibility podcast with Davide Parmigiani, where he was saying that basically it's Italians from the 80s that basically
yes.
Right, that basically dictated the taste, especially in collecting Patek Philippe's. Now, he gave two names, one of which is extremely Italian, just like my name, Sandro Frattini, and the other one that's not Italian at all, John Goldberger, who sounds more like a wrestler than an Italian. Could you tell us, first of all, a little bit about John Goldberger and why his name is John Goldberger, but from Italy? And second, how did that kind of connection go from, Patek in Geneva to Italy to what it is today?
Well, first about John Goldberger, I don't know if I'm allowed to say his real name, which it happens to be a very Italian name. He's one of the world's greatest collectors, scholars, and a gentleman. And he chose this pen name of John Goldberger, I believe years ago. And if the book Patek Philippe Steel Watches, if you haven't seen this book, it's highly recommended for your library. And I believe you could even download it. You could get digital copies too. So you can get into the mind of John Goldberger. And And that's important because the bigger story here is the Italians and the marketplace. And if you have the opportunity, please listen to my podcast, the Collectibility podcast with Davide Parmigiani, because it's an hour and a half delving into the mind of the Italian collector, the Italian dealer, and how the Italians influence this market. But in short, the Italians were first to really look at the wristwatch in a way as art and investment combined. And during the 1980s, many well-to-do Italian families and collectors started putting these pieces away and hunting the world to find the best timepieces. And this was an extraordinary era for Patek Philippe collecting. It culminated in 1989 with the first Art of Patek Philippe auction from Antiquorum. So the story is still being told. Italian tastemakers and scholars are still at the forefront of this marketplace. And without the Italians, we wouldn't have the market that we have today, for sure.
Yeah, which I find so interesting, right? I mean, no, I don't think a lot of people make that connection between Switzerland, Italy, and now the rest of the world, and the kind of influence they have. I wanted to talk about Patek and its limited production of timepieces, right? Would you say, first off, that this limited production is really part of what makes the watches more desirable?
Yeah, there is, of course, a big supply and demand story here, but I'm about to share a metric which might, well, it blows my mind, and I'm happy to share it globally. And it is this: Patek Philippe made 1 million pieces from its founding in 1839 until 2002. Point being, it wasn't until 2002 that Patek Philippe made 1 million watches. There are other brands, Big Green, I don't know if I'm allowed to say their name, that make that type of amount that quantity of watches annually. So you can kind of see the surprising difference in numbers. But here's the stat that really blows my mind. Since the year 2002 until today, Patek Philippe has made another 1 million watches.
Wow.
So there are now 2 million Patek Philippes estimated that exist in the world today. So when you drill into that, that's amazing that the first from 1839 to 2002 is the first 1 million.
Yeah.
Now looking at this chart, it could even help you understand this more. Just look at the production from 1839 to 1965, and you could see how it was a very slow and stable growth. If you dig into the 1940s through the 60s, you start to understand how small the production was, of approximately average 5,000 pieces per year. It wasn't until, we'll call it the Italian bump, in the 1980s, where demand grew globally and the manufacturer was capable of making more pieces. So if I'm going to play the supply and demand game, which a lot of market-driven people do, I want to look at pieces that are before 1965.
Yeah.
Now, being more of a historian, I absolutely love pieces dating back before 1900, and that brings you into the pocket watch era. Because not only you're buying rarity and artistry and technological genius, you're buying something that historically, and whether it's 10 years now or hundreds of years from now, it's something that's quite special and quite unique. And this is why I think Patek Philippe has a little extra magic. Is the fact that the supply is oh so low.
No, amazing. This includes the pocket watches. This
Everything. Absolutely everything.
Unbelievable. Yeah. Now, this actually leads me to the next question, though. At 2002, what specifically about 2002 was it where Patek was like, okay, time to ramp up production, like hockey stick style?
Well, that's the time I started at Patek Philippe working there in 2001. And we were telling people when I started, I was trained to tell people that approximately 45,000 pieces were made. But I was trying to ask, like, is that the real number? And I heard numbers anywhere from 45 to 65 100,000. Some outside sources told me production was 75,000. And even today, when you ask someone from Patek Philippe, you're going to hear a number in that 50 to 60 range. No one knows the truth. It's a family-owned company. They could be making 20,000 a year. They can make 100,000 a year. They don't have to tell us. But the bottom line is, it's a very small production relative to others. And I do believe that today's Patek Philippe's are, it's not even arguable, it's fact. They're some of the finest timepieces ever made in terms of beauty, accuracy, and technology. And people love debating that, but it's a conversation worth having.
Well, and just to make a point of that, I think that it's interesting that they could, increase their scale like this, yet still maintain a very consistent quality in the movement of the pieces and just the beauty of the design, even from that, from that perspective, right?
And one major point to dovetail on what you just said, is no coincidence that the introduction of CNC technology and CAD design combined in the 1980s led to this jump that we're looking at in this chart. I mean, I hate to say that's the simple answer of why. The quality of machining is extraordinary, and that has allowed Patek Philippe to retain quality, build on the quality, and make more watches. Which is another reason when I look at a beautiful wristwatch from 1942, it captures my heart, because I know it was made in a different way. It was made more by hand and had more traditional technology than something that you could buy today.
Gotcha. When you make your reference to the 1942 watch, are we speaking about the reference 3424J by any chance?
No, but that's a good segue.
Oh, okay. Well, I'm just checking.
This is 20 years later. This is from 1961.
Okay.
And this is a watch that was designed by Gilbert Albert, and a shout out to a prior guest, Ronnie Madvani, who I think has really put Gilbert Albert on a pedestal that is very well deserved. And he personally has one of the best, if not the best, collection outside of the Patek Philippe Museum. So Ronnie, this slide's for you. The 3424s and the whole asymmetrical collection from this period was the brainchild of Gilbert Albert, who was the head of the design atelier within Patek Philippe during this short period of time. Now, Patek, they knew that there was changes in the marketplace, so they wanted to hire the young, upcoming designer. And Gilbert Albert, when he joined Patek Philippe, was in his 20s. And they put this gentleman in charge of a workshop with a lot of men and women that were much older than he was. I could only imagine what that was like. And he was a big personality. He did some bold designs during this era in 61. This was an impossible watch to sell. This was too far ahead of the era.
Way out.
That's why there's so few of them in existence. And when they do show up at auction, Ronnie and I are bidding against each other. So
I see.
So there are great watches to be found, but they're not easy to find today.
But what do you say about that, right? This resurgence of vintage Patek collecting. I mean, do you think that this is it a trend? Is it here to stay? Where are we at with vintage Pateks?
Oh, I'm very bullish that for vintage of the right quality and condition, and we'll talk about that momentarily, will continue to go up in value. Looking historically at auction prices, there have been bumps downward, but the bumps upward are more punctuated, and we're living through one right now. It's just extraordinary new price points that we're seeing. And this, over the next 6 days, the Geneva auctions are going to show that trend continues with more world records. I think we're going to be seeing from Sotheby's, Christie's, Phillips, and Antiquorum. And the auction houses are the public trading floor that we'll be seeing these very big numbers blasted to the world. So it's a story. It's still being told. We're living in the middle of it, and I think this trend will continue for the foreseeable future.
It's true. I feel like every year, it's like every year nowadays, you just read these massive headlines of these unbelievable almost,
Yeah,
prices. They're
and
just higher and higher and higher every year. It's great.
very true. Very true.
Um, okay, now talking about a collector, right? In your opinion, what should a Patek collector acquire for their collection?
It's although we're seeing record prices all around, it's a lot of fun to identify the upcoming stars.
Right.
There are pieces that you can buy today that are still relative values. And a lot of people are scared by Patek Philippe because they're like, oh, I have to go spend millions of dollars. The truth is you could buy a Patek Philippe for a pocket watch for $4,000 or $5,000 that can start your collection. But the last two slides we showed first a 3970, a 3940 gilt perpetual calendar, and now we're looking at a 3970. These two references I identify as rising stars, and prices in the last 3 months have just gone up, and away in some surprising ways. 3940s, I mean, for the last 20 years, I mean, you could buy them for really reasonable prices.
Yeah.
It was funny because 3940 was generally under 40, and 3970s were often around 70. And now we're seeing prices, go up 30 to 50% quite quickly. But I think that trend will continue. And if you buy a 3940 or a 3970, really understand the series, understand the hallmarks, understand the importance of box papers, extra case back when applicable, you're going to own a piece that not only you could wear, but a treasure that will do well in the future if that is your motive. But most importantly, look how beautiful that watch is. I mean, this is a first series 3940 gilt with sunken registers. That's from the earliest production years of the reference. It's very similar to the watch the owner of Patek Philippe Stern wears. That's his personal watch, is early 3940 gilt dial.
Beautiful.
There's a reason for that. This is just pure aesthetic beauty, simplicity, and all of the technology developed dating back to the 19th century is within this watch. All that know-how is literally on your wrist. So 3940s and 3970s are my not so much of an insider tip, but something that I recommend that you find, because they're still
beautiful,
obtainable at good prices.
I do have to note, and we'll go into this a little bit later on about the sport watch models of Patek, right? But it does seem like sometimes that the sport watches were like the entry into Patek, right? Like people were just, it's like the marketing of Patek. People are like, oh, I need a sport watch. But as people's tastes change or refine, it looks like they start looking at other, areas of the Patek line. I mean, would you agree to that?
No, I do agree with that, and we could see it clearly on Instagram of what people are putting on their wrists and what likes they're getting. Frankly, people aren't putting pocket watches on and getting 2,000 likes. You see it more commonly with an Aquanaut or a Nautilus. This is kind of the it watch of the moment, the steel sports watch. And it's also part of a trend. Our culture globally is becoming more informal. I mean, it's jeans and t-shirts and sport wear. It's dressing up with a more traditional timepiece is not the norm. But now, like with anything, the pendulum swings both directions. And we're seeing gem set watches, which traditionally are for evening wear, are white hot at the moment, and people are going crazy for gem set pieces. So it's hard to identify a trend without seeing the reactive trend at the same time.
Yeah. What could potentially be a trend, John, that isn't even part of the pendulum right now are clocks. Right?
Yeah, that was a good pun with the pendulum. I don't think these I don't
what I
think
do.
these are on many people's radar, but like looking around my office, I collect these personally. I've only over 20 solar desk clocks.
Uh-huh.
I can't get enough of these
Wow.
because they're so reasonable. And the part that really amuses me is when you look at how much these timepieces cost in the price and compare them to the wristwatches you could buy at the same time.
Yeah.
For example, this solar dome desk clock from 1960 would have been the equivalent price point of a 24.99 in 1960, the perpetual chrono.
Wow.
So if we got in our time machine and I went to the Patek Philippe salon and bought this clock for about $800 in 1960, today it's worth, on a good day, 20,000.
Right.
But if I bought the 24.99 and the right configuration, today it's worth $2.5 million. So this disconnect is so significant. I just love it. And that's why I can't stop buying these clocks, because these are such artistic beauties. And although it may look exactly like R2D2, there's a reason for it. This
Yeah.
the top of this dome clock contains the solar panel, and you could rotate the top of that. I have one right here. It's the best way to show it.
Oh, there you
Can
go.
you see it in frame? So,
Yeah, a little bit. Yeah. If you could.
should I hold it? All
There
right.
you go. Yeah. There
All
you go.
right. So you could actually rotate this like this towards the window. So the
Oh,
clock,
so cool.
depending where you have it placed, you
Yeah.
just put this towards the light source and it powers the clock through the accumulator. So it's very functional design. So
It's true.
those little stories, and once you get into the clocks, they just keep adding up, are important and very interesting. And I find this is a segment of the marketplace that's still being ignored. But like everything, it'll be discovered and we'll see what happens next.
Yeah, and you heard it here first, I guess.
Yeah.
And by the way, I just have to note, right? As cases are getting larger and diameters are getting bigger, there could be a future where people are wearing that on their wrist. Am I right?
It's possible. It's not very comfortable, and it's about 5 pounds, but
I mean, that looks like some of the sport watches that are available out there from other brands already.
this is true. Exactly.
Just kidding. Okay, so let's go back. Oh, sorry, before I go to the next question in the next slides, I did want to just remind everybody that if anybody has a question for John, specific to the brand Patek, specific to vintage Patek, or clocks that are Patek, please make sure you put it in the chat box and we'll make sure to address it later on. Okay, now going to the next slide, we're going to talk a little bit about vintage watch collecting, right? I mean, I love vintage watch collecting. I love to it's the process of discovery, I think, right? But of course, there's some danger with vintage watch collecting, especially for first timers. Not danger, but difficulties, let's say. What advice can you give to a first-time collector who wants to start looking at vintage pieces, vintage Patek pieces?
I hate to start with this, but let the buyer beware. That's the number one point. Whether you're buying from auction or from a local store, everything you need to understand is what you're buying, why you're buying it, and document everything. Many people have said the most important thing is to know the seller, and this is important. The relationships that Vintage Grail has with your clients, I mean, those are sacred. It's trust. They need to know that what they're buying is what you're presenting, and that's always a fun dialogue. There's a lot of magic in those conversations, and with my collectibility clients, I mean, it's friends and family, and you can tell when I speak to a new client, it's like, I'm going to be friends with this person. It's because I could speak for hours about a particular caliber or a particular movement or reference. And we are a small community, even though it's global. That's what's so wonderful about this. You need to find someone that you know and you could learn from and learn together. And that's my first opening comment about being cautious, being smart, and developing the right relationships, and delving into the vintage watch world. Now, the reason it's so tricky is because the scholarship is still evolving. So when you look at a case back like this from the 2511, there are many secret codes that you need to understand when you're looking at it, and that will help identify if there are issues, and to help actually make collecting more pleasurable. Because when I look at this image, it just makes me smile because it tells a storyline and tells about the beauty of an important timepiece. And there are ways that you can compare and contrast, and you literally have to look at hundreds of inside case backs or movements in order to start developing patterns, comparing and contrasting. You need to know what you're looking at. And just a couple of things off the top of my mind is look at that beautiful finish inside the case of the circles, which is called perlage. As a pattern, it's just so elegant within a case. And you also see this pattern on movements. You also see on the bottom the reference number 2511. Mm-hmm. Above that is the case number. And as with all Patek Philippe's that have ever been made, there's the extracts from the archives that reflect back to these movement numbers that show the date that the watch was made and the original date the watch was sold. To have those facts based on every timepiece they've ever made, approximately 2 million, as we discussed, that is really gives a bedrock of confidence in knowing what you're buying. But then when you dig deeper into gold marks, and here you can see the Helvetia, the head of Helvetia on the far right above the number 3, which is the Swiss gold mark from the era. You see the 18K mark, and on the left within the hammer is the 170, which is the secret case mark. And when you understand who's making the cases for Patek Philippe, it will unleash a whole other set of questions and an interesting insight into the world of how watches were made, and how if you buy a Patek Philippe or almost any watch, they outsourced a lot of that work. And the hints are all told through these marks and through documentation, and the story for each of these timepieces is maybe a bit longer than you imagine. And that's what makes this so much fun. So I don't want to scare people away from vintage collecting, because there's so much information on the internet and from scholars globally. But my advice is this: know what you're buying, study it, become your own expert, and you're going to enjoy the hobby even more through that process, and you won't make mistakes.
Yeah, I think you're right. I mean, I think it increases the obsession, right? Because it's really in the detail that actually increases that leads us all to obsess over all these different types of watches. Would you say though that just in general on case backs, at least these 5 elements at the bottom should be found at a Patek case back? Is that a safe?
No, that's the great thing is you can't generalize, because during different periods there's different marks. If we were looking at a steel case back from the same period, be a whole different set of marks. Even within the same reference, within the same year, you're going to see different sets of marks. So there's also certain imperfections that you're looking for. So you might, in some cases, we're able to identify, well, in almost all cases, forgeries through their perfection. In the same way that a diamond expert can tell if a diamond is fake because it has no inclusions.
Yes.
The watch experts are doing the same thing. There's things that you can tell on dials, cases, and movements that help you understand what is real and what may not be real, or might have been restored or replaced.
That is super interesting, actually. I love that, because if it's too perfect, it might be just a stamp, a machine, something like this, that just gives it away, right?
Like even looking at this case back, you see how the Patek Philippe was at an angle It
Yeah.
wasn't perfectly lined up. That's great to see. And the way that the numbers were actually cut with the pantograph machine, it's a certain way that it was done during that period that we're looking at.
All right. So now I think just to look at the other side of the case back, the part that it's protecting. I think what we're going to talk about now is kind of the differences between, what we see with vintage and modern, right? Tell us a little bit about the differences between the two types of timepieces, vintage and modern.
Absolutely. In a moment, we're going to look at a modern movement, but here's a piece from the early 1950s, a beautiful Valjoux Eboche chronograph movement for the reference 533 in yellow gold. And I mean, this is just sheer artistry. Keeping in mind, this was first designed on paper before all of those, the bridges, the gears, the cams, that was all done on paper before it was made three-dimensional. So I see aesthetically, there's something very pleasing about the earlier wristwatch movements and also pocket watch movements that has been lost today when people are designing more for function. And that's all about modern CAD designed movements and cases. It's about functionality first. But this to me is an aesthetic beauty of a movement that isn't even meant to be seen. During the 50s, there's no sapphire case backs. And the fact that this type of effort was put into the aesthetic treatments in not only the design, but the finish, to me is just all about the superlative qualities that make watch collecting what it is. So let's look at something a little more modern in the next slide.
Yeah, let's take a look.
So here's a 5102.
Look at that.
This is a 5102G. This is all white gold celestial. And you'll see what's so amazing about this is the technology has gone next level. Here we have a sky chart showing from the northern hemisphere. You can see the Milky Way, the 5 magnitudes of stars. So you can see how bright the stars are and compare to what you'd see outside with the same timepiece. But on the other hand, you're not seeing something that's handmade by enamel. This is a photographic process that makes these discs in this amazing display. So I have nothing but awe and respect for the technology here. But when I look at like a moon phase from a pocket watch from 1875 that was made by hand, and it's so completely imperfect, even the points of the star could be considered messy under magnification. I just love that. I love it just as much as I love the technology of this modern marvel. But I think we have to respect and understand there's just two different ways of appreciating it. The same way you might look at a vintage Ferrari different than something that rolled off the production line today. They're different, but they still have the same DNA.
Right. Yeah. I mean, I think there's just to go back into the same theme, I think there's a lot of beauty in the imperfections of vintage watches as well, that that it's literally the hand of somebody that really helped put that watch together. And I think that's kind of the appeal of vintage and to vintage watch collectors. But of course, you look at this and it's like, oh my goodness, they have elevated watchmaking so that it's outer space. It's
reaching for the stars, literally.
Yeah,
I love it.
Exactly. I mean, okay, just going to that for a second, then what does make vintage timepieces, from Patek as attractive as compared to their modern counterparts? I mean, is it really just the handmade part of it, or is there more elements in your opinion, or are there more?
It's such a good question, Franco. It's really about the struggle towards perfection. And when speaking to the Sterns, whether going back generations to Henry Stern, Philippe Stern, now Thierry Stern, they're all going to tell you the same thing. It's the march towards perfection to make the most perfect watch. And the word perfection isn't used lightly. But what is perfection? We might interpret differently.
Yeah.
Yeah, getting into their heads, I would just speculate perfection is accuracy in timekeeping. Number one, is environmental. How would you say, like, mitigating environmental problems such as magnetism, moisture, shock resistance. I mean, all of this is kind of the march of horology. In today's Patek Philippe's are the most perfect watches, but in order to make the most perfect watch, they can't be made only by the human hand. You need the help of technology. So that's really defining modern watchmaking today. And this slide emphasizes that point in the most beautiful way. Here we have the movement of the Patek Philippe reference 5175 Grandmaster chime from 2014. This was made for the 175th anniversary. There's 7 examples made. On the left, you're looking at the back of the dial, and on the right, you're looking at, on the left, you're looking at the back of the movement, and on the right, you're looking at an under dial image.
Yes.
If we asked Antoine Norbert de Patek or Adrian Philippe to look at this watch somehow from a time traveling vehicle, the founders of Patek Philippe would be in complete awe. They'd be very proud of what they saw here, because in the march of horological history, this is Mount Everest, and that is exciting. Now, there are still elements of traditional watchmaking that the founders would acknowledge. They would see the chamfered edges, the Côte de Genève. They would see some very, very familiar finishing techniques made on each of the bridges. I think Adrian Philippe would be, what's the deal with the Patek Philippe seal?
Yeah.
Rather than the Geneva seal.
That's
but,
right.
I think they would ask some questions about the technology they're looking at. And another thing, this is a fun game to play. I think they'd look at the moon phase here, in the sky chart, and be like, what's going on there? It looks way too perfect. And because the early ones were made with Chanlevé enamel, so they were cut by hand and filled with beautiful blue enamel. So if you look at what you see even on 1518s or any early perpetuals, the moon phase is alive. I look at this moon phase and it's like, it's perfect, but it doesn't have soul. So it's fun looking at it from the eyes of the past. But at the end of the day, I think if Adrian and Antoine were sitting here, they'd be very proud of what Patek Philippe has become. And they'd look at this technology, they'd be really looking at the gongs and how they're structured and how they're finished. And they'd be quite proud of what Patek Philippe has become today.
So this would basically be the culmination of all of their efforts, all historical efforts of Patek.
I think, the other, I mean, if they were able to see the Calibre 89 and some of the other pieces that were made in the 20th century, they'd also be very proud. But the miniaturization of this technology that we see here in a wristwatch would just blow their minds.
Yeah, that's so true. Beautiful. Okay, so we touched upon this a little bit earlier in the conversation, and now we're talking about modern watches, right? And of course, one can't speak about Patek Philippe these days without speaking about, well, stainless steel sport watches. What are your thoughts on the present hype towards stainless steel Patek watches?
Wow. Looking at this after we were diving deep into the aesthetic and technical history of Patek Philippe, it actually helps put it into context of what this is. This is a social media driven insanity with the supply demand issue.
I mean, this is like
being very diplomatic. Yeah, it's the perfect storm. Now, I love the Nautilus. Don't get me wrong, but I love the Nautilus at a certain price point, and it's
Yeah.
not what we're seeing today, which is just insanity. People are buying this because they're told they can't have it, and that's not the right reason to buy a Nautilus. Now, some collectors, I'm thinking of one gentleman in California, and I know he'll watch this. He just acquired his green dial,
Okay. Oh,
and
wow.
he is so proud of this watch because he was able to buy it at retail, which is approximately
That's like impossible. That's
30
literally
something
impossible.
thousand.
Yeah.
And he and I'm going to leave out the expletive. He said, "I'm going to wear this blinking watch to every single day until it's all blank and messed up." He has a way with words. So for people who wear it and they enjoy it and
Yeah.
use it for its function, as in this case as a sports watch, that's what it's all about.
That's right.
For these guys out there, like, oh, I'm bragging about it Instagram, I paid 10 times retail, and I'm going to keep it sealed in a box so it's worth more tomorrow. That's not collecting. I don't know what that is. That's just like trying to create a bubble, and that's very concerning to me. So I'm critical of the speculation aspect, but for those of you out there buying this to wear it and enjoy it, which is what the point of watches is, that is great. That's what it's all about.
Yeah, and I mean, just to make a point there too, I think that this specific watch, the Nautilus and the Aquanaut, are very functional. You know, it's like you can bang this up. You can walk around and sweat in it, and you know, just wear it. And I think that's kind of an interesting part about it too, is that minus the social media hype, let's say, and out in the streets in the wild when you're walking around with these types of watches, it's so fun to wear one and have nobody know about it, right? That's one thing, right? And just kind of have it and know that you have it. I think that's part of it. But also to feel comfortable enough to, let's say, go swimming with these watches.
Exactly.
Like that. I think
I couldn't agree more.
Right?
I'm just looking at now. I'm here. My favorite and first Patek, the Aquanaut.
Okay.
When I was working for Patek Philippe, I dreamed of wearing a Patek Philippe. I was put on the road, expected to sell Patek Philippe. There's two of us that covered the country at that time. And I remember going to the president and saying, I can't go to stores and represent the brand without having a Patek Philippe on the wrist. I was like, can I have one? And I remember it was Hank Edelman. He laughed at me. He's like, no, there's no free watches. It's like, you can work for one, you can buy one. And I counted the days until I was able to afford this watch, which is, it's a simple mid-size Aquanaut. And at that time, it was the least expensive watch in the line. Because the whole idea of the Aquanaut is to introduce people to the brand, a younger clientele. And I've worn this watch into the ground, and I love it. And in fact, this weekend I'm going to run the New York Marathon, my 5th marathon, and for the 5th time, I'll be wearing this on my wrist, all 26.2 miles. And it is, to me, that's what this is all about. If you have a Patek Philippe sports watch, wear it for sports.
Exactly. And by the way, you're doing two things that I definitely want to do in the next couple of years: run the marathon and run it in an Aquanaut. Amazing.
There you go. It's like we could start a whole new club.
Yeah. I'll be the first, but we have to name it something as interesting as what was it called again? The worshipful company. We're going to call it
clockmakers.
Yes, we're going to call it the worshipful company of Aquanaut marathon runners.
I like that. That's great.
Thank
you. All right.
Yeah, so, that's the next one.
We're both signed up. Let's do it.
There you go. Listen, I've just got one last question before we turn to some questions, which I'm seeing. Oh, I'm seeing some good questions coming in. Well, my last question to you actually is, what would be your ultimate Grail Patek timepiece to own?
Oh, I can't give one answer, so I'm going to give two. If it's all right with you. So,
yeah,
first, on the vintage front, I'm so spoiled being surrounded by so many beautiful watches, especially during my time at auction. There are pieces that I could never dream of buying. The most incredible 1518s and 2499s. But one watch I did have the pleasure of spending time with was the Henry Graves Super Complication from 1933. And this, if I could have any watch in the world and money was no object, this would be the piece. Yet, it's impossible. It's in a private collection, and the owners have no desire to sell it. So I'm out of luck. But we could always dream. So,
Okay.
but on the modern front, I might have an opportunity this weekend.
Okay.
Because on Sunday, Only Watch in Geneva, hosted by Christie's, is selling an incredible Patek Philippe desk clock. And as you know, I love clocks, and this is the holy grail of clocks. We'll call it the Henry Graves Super Complication of clocks, is being offered on Sunday. And Patek Philippe used as a template a desk clock made for James Ward Packard of Packard Automobiles to make this timepiece. So this is the Graves Super Complication. But can we look at the next slide for the clock?
Look at this. Okay, let's take a look at that clock. Now we're also
there it is. That's my Grail. That's my Grail right there. So this Patek Philippe has 9 patents, new patents, for this timepiece that they made uniquely for this charity auction. And it's not getting as much press as I expected. I just wrote an article, waxing poetic, about why I think this piece is so important on my site. And I really think that the top collectors in the world, and I'm really speaking to 10 of you out there today, and I know at least 8 are listening to our chat right now.
I think so.
Do not put the paddle down. Bid. It's going to a great cause. And at the end of the day, this is a piece for the history books. In 50 years, doing a presentation like this, we'll be talking about this clock. And you only have one chance to buy it, and that's this Sunday.
Fantastic. Thanks for sharing, John. Really appreciate that. I think we've learned a lot from our little conversation here. But of course, I think that we have more to learn.
More philosophy, yes. So I'd like to quote Dr. Schwend, who is a great collector from the early stages of the wristwatch and pocket watch collecting world. And he said, one must know how to purchase exceptional objects today at tomorrow's prices. And just think of what we could have all bought a year ago, 5 years ago, or 10 years ago, and we all want to cry. So I think we just have to remember this quote when we're shopping, because you just don't want to have, we'll call it buyer's regret, but in the sense that you regretted you didn't buy it.
Yeah. Very true. That's very true. That's awesome. That's a very poignant quote given today's market prices for all types of watches, and definitely almost all Pateks, with the exception of pocket watches and clocks. So I think that's where tomorrow's prices come into play. Today's watches at tomorrow's prices. And so we've learned a lot from you. I think we do have one more slide just in case for our viewers, if they want to learn even more from John. Of course, you can check out his YouTube channel, Collectibility. You can follow him on Instagram at Collectibility LLC. And then, of course, your website, John, is collectibility.com.
Oh, thanks,
is there anywhere else we can find you, just in case?
No, in the podcast universe, we're on every platform, but it's easiest to follow them on YouTube, because then you get all of the content of the videos and the interviews. So
nice. Perfect. So now I'm going to turn to some questions, and I'm actually seeing some questions from some friends of yours and some friends of ours. But before that, I'll get into some of our international viewers right now. So we've got Lim from Malaysia, and Lim is asking if there's any specific era of Patek Philippe that interests you, and which few references that you specifically like in that era and why.
Thanks, Lim. That's a great question. I think I've always loved Calatravas. because they're accessible in terms of price point, and the variety is endless. So a nice Calatrava from the 40s through the 60s is something that you can get on your wrist quickly and across all price points, from well under 10,000 US to into the millions. You'll have choices. And these are pieces you could wear. Like a simple 2 or 3 hander is the way to go when with the Patek Philippe. So personally, I love Patek Philippe time onlys when I'm looking for a watch just to put on the wrist and to enjoy and to wear.
Okay, thank you. Daniel Sum, okay, this is very specific to the 3970. Daniel Sum is asking about the 3970 coming in the 5004 dial configuration and how the dial configuration came to be. And if you know this, how many pieces were produced and in which metal configurations?
Thank you, Daniel. Daniel, I'd expect a question like this from you. So thanks for joining us today. All right, first, a lot of people don't talk about dial configurations with 3970s versus 5004s, but I'll try to set the record straight from someone who had the pleasure of working at Patek Philippe in an era where dial changes were acceptable and encouraged. So what does this mean? So picture 20 years ago, you go to a store and you wanted to buy a nice 3970 with the stick dial, but you'd prefer to have the 5004 Arabic dial on it. You would ask your AD, can I have the dial swapped out? Because you'd be looking at a book called the General Catalog that showed your dial options. The retailer would call the distributor, and the distributor would actually have dials on hand. We had 5004 dial drawer, and you would be able to take a 5004 dial and put it onto a 3970. And it was great because the distributor made a sale, the retailer made a sale, and then consumer had the configuration that they wanted. But here's where it gets crazy. Then 10 years later, you bought that watch and you want to get an extract from the archives because you hear that Patek issues extracts for all dial changes, or for all watches they've ever made. And the dial change is not reflected on the archives. Reason being is because it was done by a distributor. And although you bought the watch in that configuration, you will not have absolute proof of that from Patek Philippe. So that's disappointing for some collectors. Documentation is everything, and this is very important that if you do have something special done for you, have it documented as much as possible. But in terms of production numbers, Daniel, off the top of my head, 3970 and 5004 production numbers they're not up here right now, but I do have them, and I'll reach out to me afterwards. I'll get the actual numbers for you, and I hope I answered some of your question, but we could talk offline to get more in depth.
Nice. Cool. Tomas Cueva, he's asking about the 5204, and he says it's one of his favorite references to aspire to reach someday. Do you see it becoming as iconic or legendary as the 5004? Why or why not?
Oh, absolutely. I think as the march of perpetual split seconds moves forward, the 5204 is now the king. That is the watch to have. It's available, as you know, in different configurations. I love rose gold 5204s. I just think it has such ironically, a sporty look for a split second perpetual. But anything that you're buying today, look back where it came from, where that watch evolved from, knowing how it came from the 5004 and before that the 3970 aesthetic, and then you're going to know its place kind of in the pantheon of Patek Philippe collecting. And without a doubt, the 5204 is a watch that will be on the cover of auction catalogs in the future. So I hope you get one soon.
There you go. That's a good tip. Charlie Dunn is asking, John, personalized dials are among the most sought after vintage or pre-owned Patek Philippe's. Do you anticipate that there will be a future where preserved case back engravings will fetch much higher premiums than what we see today?
Great question, Charlie, and thanks for joining us from the East Coast of the United States this morning.
That's right. He's up.
Yeah, he's up early. And asking, he's had his coffee because he's asking a tough question.
I know.
All right, I'm going to answer it this way. It's all about authenticity and proving that any dial, special dials, or special inscriptions are original to the watch. What I like about pocket watches is these notations are quite clear on the extracts from the archives. If the back of a watch was engraved JR, the pocket watch from 1878, it's going to tell me that on the archive, which is very nice to know. But in the era of wristwatches and today, it's not documented in any way. You can have Patek Philippe today have engrave your watch and save your documentation if you do that. But and I expect Charlie's asking more on the vintage front is having an engraved presentation on the back of it. All right, well, if it's to or from Paul Newman, I would say it's a good thing. But very good thing. If it's someone of historical note, it's always very interesting to tell the story. If we know the provenance of the watch and having someone's initials or engraving helps build the story and it's documented, I love having initials, monogram, or presentation on the back of a watch. So long answer short, I think it will be part of the value of these timepieces. In the past, I heard a lot of collectors saying, I don't want to have anything on the back of the watch. I want it polished off. And today I hear often, keep it on there. It's part of the watch's story.
It's true. So somewhat related to this, I've actually got two questions from two different people in the audience asking about double-sided dials.
Mm-hmm.
So somebody's asking about the collectibility of Tiffany dials or Kanjar dials, and while the other is asking just about simply your thoughts on them, and the relationship between, well, Patek and Tiffany very specifically.
Yeah. First, with the Middle Eastern dials, I love seeing Kanjars, seeing in the case of some of the Saudi watches, the King of Saudi Arabia in enamel from the 1950s.
So cool.
I love seeing, I have to ask some of my friends in Arabic what the dials actually say. I had one watch recently that had something written, it was an ellipse with something written in Arabic, and I had it translated and it said General Muammar Gaddafi on the dial.
Oh, wow.
It's just wow. And so Patek Philippe in the 70s and 80s and even early 90s had a lot of Middle Eastern contracts, and they would do custom dials for leaders for presentation gifts and also special pieces for families themselves. And these are fun to collect, and I think they're really enjoyable. In terms of retailer signatures, this is a tradition that was very common in the United States 120 years ago. It was hard to buy a watch that didn't have a retailer signature on the dial and the movement. And Tiffany was at the forefront of that. Today, Tiffany is the last brand that has its name on the dial with Patek Philippe. And joking back to collectors and how collecting tastes have changed, I remember in the late 90s, collectors would tell me, is like, I don't want any of those watches that say Tiffany on them. It's just graffiti on the dial. And today, those same watches that have Tiffany and Patek Philippe on the dial bring a significant premium at auction. So to see a Serpico Iliano dial from Caracas is very exciting on a vintage watch. To see a Gobi on the dial, to see I mean the buyer on the dial, the list goes on, is very exciting. And a lot of these watches live with nicknames around the retailers they were sold. So Charlie, at the end of the day, it's a retailer signatures are a good thing. Yeah. It's the end of an era with just Tiffany is the last one doing it, and it's a story that's still being told, but we're kind of coming to the end of it, unfortunately. Well, we'll see how much longer Tiffany has their stamp on the dial. Time will tell.
Okay, I've got two last questions from you. Actually, there's a lot more, but I'm going to wrap it up with two last questions for you. One is Jonathan Charney. He said, he's asking, I know you like form watch and repeaters. What would you buy now?
Wow, it's form watches.
Yeah.
A few years ago, there was a form watch that sold at Christie's while I was there in the form of a backpack. And it was for Egyptologists that Patek Philippe wanted to make a special piece. And it was made of tricolor gold. It had his hat, has various the various like picks, all of his tools. And then you lift up the hat and you see the dial. For me, that is the form watch holy grail. There are form watches in the shape of hearts. There are form watches in the shape of books and pretty much anything you could imagine. And when you go to the Patek Philippe Museum, you can see some of their form watches. And I think that is a really, really great question, Jonathan, is like, what's the storyline of form watches? And I think that's something that Collectibility would like to tackle, perhaps with your help. So thank you for that.
There you go. Finally, I'm going to wrap it up with a friend of ours, Ronnie Madvani's question. In your career, what has been the best story of a barnyard find that you have personally made? And he knows he loves those.
Oh, Ronnie, first of all, it's such an honor that you're with us today. Thank you so much. It's and of course, you live the final question, which is the most difficult one to answer, because so many of my stories I could share over dinner or a drink, but it's very difficult to share publicly where it's going to stay out there. But I'll share this one and leave out names to protect the innocent. But there was a watch that a gentleman inherited from, I believe he was his grandfather was a doctor, and this gentleman inherited this timepiece, and it was a cushion-shaped Patek Philippe. He didn't really know the brand. He didn't know what it was, but he wore it in honor of his grandfather. He was a roofer. So he would go on the roof, remove shingles, and still have granddad's watch on. But one day, the watch fell off his wrist onto the ground. So it was sad, but it was a little beat up. So he just put it in his pickup truck and forgot about it. A year later, he takes the watch to a local jeweler and says, "Hey, can you fix up my granddaddy's watch?" And the jeweler says, "All right, I have a friend, John Reardon in New York. I'll send him some pictures." I get the picture. It's a platinum cushion minute repeater from the 1920s. I mean, a complete holy grail piece. And the crystal fell off. It was a bit scratched up, and he chose to have it restored to the right level. And if I remember right, I think it brought the family at the end of the day $600,000 or $700,000. And I think the punchline of the story is he bought a couple college educations and a couple new pickup trucks with the proceeds. So that's a gift from Granddad that I think we all want to have.
Yeah, that's an amazing gift, and what a find indeed. Well, fantastic, John. Thank you so much for sharing some of your insights and helping to answer some of the questions from the great members of the audience today.
Thank you, Frank. You're an amazing host, and we covered a lot in this chat.
Yeah, we really did. It's been so interesting. And of course, again, there's so much more to learn from you in your podcast, Collectibility podcast, which I guess can be found in any podcast service. So you were talking about Spotify, Apple Music, all that.
And there's links on our site, but also Spotify, Apple, you'll find the podcast. And stay tuned. There's one per month, and there's some really exciting guests lined up for the future. So please stay tuned.
Awesome. So anyway, thanks everybody for all of your questions. I think we're just going to wrap this up with a showcase to just show some interesting timepieces. It's very short. We're just gonna show you what what we've seen through our doors at Vintage Grail and what are available at the store today. So let's take a quick look at that. There you go. I did want to note that everybody that's in the audience today, we will be sending out our catalog via email or WhatsApp to all of you, so you can take a closer look at not just the Pateks that are available, but all the watches that we have available in our shop. So please stay tuned for that. So finally, I'd like to thank you, John, for helping us, further appreciate and value this really important, watchmaker. We really appreciate the opportunity to speak with you.
Thank you so much, Franco, and for all of us. Let's enjoy this global treasure hunt. It's one of the greatest pleasures in the world is finding these timepieces, and there's still plenty out there to uncover.
It really is a treasure hunt, isn't it? So yeah, I mean, I wish for all of us to find the treasure that we're all looking for. So from all of us here at Vintage Grail, thank you everybody for joining us this evening, and stay safe. Take care, everyone.